talking dies and Gries? What's this about, Richard? What's going on here?
Well, it was a post that I spotted on Facebook on the micro collection and diecast group, and it really intrigued me and it led to a great discussion. So I thought, well, who better to bring on the show than Ron Salvatore, who contributed to the discussion. So let's cut over to that interview now. So I'm delighted to welcome SWCA editor Ron Salvatore to the show. Good morning, Ron.
Good morning, Richard. Or, well, I guess it's good evening for you, right? But it's morning for me. Hope you're doing well.
Well, it's normally morning for me. It's normally 1:30 in the morning when I call you up. So times are working better.
Well, I always appreciate your fortitude as far as working out these times with people when you interview them from overseas. So I appreciate that effort.
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, I know you're super busy, so we're going to keep this fairly tight. And I've got to say, first of all, thanks for all the stuff that you, Sky and Steve, have been doing on the Dynacast and the blog log pods, because they've been absolutely brilliant. If anyone's not listening to them, the last two in particular were absolutely outstanding. I love both of them, the ones on the Vans discussion and the ones on Tebow. Really, really good stuff.
Well, I'm glad you like those, Richard. Thanks. I mean, I have almost nothing to do with the podcast, so Sky and Steve get all the credit for that. But hopefully the blog posts that were used as content, hopefully you all read those, and those are the things that I put a lot of effort into. So I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed that.
Yeah. So the reason why I've asked you to come on is just because a post made by a user called Tonton Scott on the Kenner Star Wars Micro Collection Diecast group. Now, it started with a few sentences. What do you learned sages make of these writings of the base my 4 up? And it said Reb sold is self-explanatory, as is 692004, but what about the rest? And accompanying this was a photo with Gries, Gate, and the number 47. So first of all, I would guess by now that everyone is aware of what a 4 up is, and this one is unpainted, and therefore would it be correct to assume that this was either a tooling master, or would it just be an extra that was made and not used for another purpose?
I think it's pretty safe to assume it was intended for tooling. So yeah, tooling master. And I've always pronounced it Gries. I'm sorry, Gries. Maybe you said Gries. Maybe it is Gries. I'm not sure, but Gries is what I've always said. So I guess I'm going to stick with that. I'm not positive what the actual pronunciation is. But yeah, since it's unpainted and it has that Gries notation on the bottom of it, I think the assumption would be that it was intended for tooling.
Now, the 692004, he said that was self-explanatory, but it wasn't to me because I'm not a micro collector at all. So what does that refer to? Yeah,
that's basically the part number of the actual figure when it would be produced, right? So each micro playset, the prefix, which is the first 3 numbers, that refers to the actual playset, right? So if you Google the SWCA.com comprehensive micro figure, I think you'll find the special feature on the archive that is devoted to the micro collection figures, and it lays out all of the numbers. So each figure has that 6-digit number. The first 3 numbers refer to the playset, and then the last 3 numbers is the individual figure. So you can identify each micro figure by that number. And the chart on the archive gives you all the figures and all the numbers, so you can kind of go down them and look at what they are.
Right, so 692, looking at your article there, is the Hoth Iron Cannon. So that seems fairly self-explanatory. So 004, is that the 4th figure or something like that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
I mean, there was however many figures. You can probably tell by looking at that chart how many figures are in that playset, and that would be, 4 of whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
So what do you know about Gries, and how do they play a part in the toy manufacturing process here?
Well, Kenner is a fairly big toy company, and they were churning through lots of different products, right? So I think most people are probably sort of familiar with the fact that Kenner didn't produce all of the stuff themselves. They contract with quite a few different companies to help them in the creation process, bringing these items from prototype, well, basically from concept to prototype through to production. And Gries was one of the companies, or the primary company, I believe, that they used to produce the micro figures and also the tooling that were used to make the micro figures. And it was as you saw from that website, the link I posted to, they're kind of a global company, but the outfit that Kenner used that I'm familiar with was, I believe, based in Montreal, Canada. And so they contracted with them to produce a big chunk of the actual figures and the tooling for the micro figures, because Kenner just wasn't really, I don't think, set up to do that, right? especially since they didn't have a lot of experience with little metal miniatures like that. And they contracted with other companies as well. I mean, just as far as who made the 4-ups, Kenner made some of them, but we know that they used an outside vendor in the Cincinnati area to produce a lot of their micro collection 4-ups as well as their figure hard copies. So they would farm that work out to somebody else, and they would make the silicon molds and make the hard copies. I actually have some receipts and some invoices from that company for the hard copies and the molds. And then, so an outside company could make the 4-up, make the silicon mold and make the 4-up, and then that 4-up gets sent to yet another company outside of Kenner to make the actual production tooling and the actual metal figures. So that there's a lot of different entities involved, and Gries was one of them.
So Kenner wouldn't make the dies at all, would they, in this situation? I mean, I worked in die casting before, aluminium or aluminum usually, and a bit of zinc as well. But the dies are so expensive. It's not just creating the dies either. It's the maintenance of the dies over time when they wear, they crack, or they get bits of schwarf in them. So Kenner wouldn't have had anything to do with that whatsoever.
Well, I mean, they had input, right? But I mean, as far as the actual work, yeah, they farmed that out. And yeah, you're right. That's when you're making a toy like that, the biggest expense is making the tooling or the dies or the molds or whatever you want to call it. But it's made out of steel, and there's a lot of expense just to get those things set up correctly, and then you like running them and maintaining them, like you mentioned. So yeah, they didn't do that for the lion's share of their mass produced items.
Well, I don't know if you know the story of one of my former lives when I was an engineer and I worked for the Ministry of Defence, and we had 2 pallets of dies, full steel dies. Pallet A was to be kept, pallet B was to be scrapped. And
you mentioned that, yeah.
And we got them mixed up. So needless to say, there were some very unhappy customers because they dies.
Yeah. You did tell me this story. Yeah, that's bad because that's a huge expense, right? Huge. And then that's a major
swept under the carpet.
Does insurance cover that?
No, it didn't, because it was our mistake. It was a complete, human error.
Like mistake insurance. Go ahead, mistake insurance.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. I mean,
it was.
And Kenner, they're a fairly well-known toy company at that time. They have the Star Wars license and everything, but they still have a bottom line, and that's one of their giant expenses. I mean, that's, when they're making that's one of the reasons why you see paper products or cloth products come out and it's no big deal. But when you have to invest money in metal tooling, steel tooling, that is a huge expense, and companies will sometimes just opt not to make a product because it's too expensive. So.
Absolutely. So they must have had confidence in this toy line from the start in order to, head down that route.
Yeah, I mean, big decision. It was a substantial line of product. Only lasted a year and a half, so it ended up being not a huge success. But yeah, they were launching a new range of product based on their most popular license, which was Star Wars. So yeah, I would say there was quite a bit of capital behind it and quite a bit of confidence going into it.
Now, Josh Blake later on posted a note that said gate and porting line to be agreed prior to tooling design. Now this was a fantastic little snapshot of history, great document, so thanks Josh for sharing that. What would those 2 terms refer to?
Right, so the gate would be where the material flows into the tool, right? So it's the area, probably right in the feet area where there's a gate, and that's where the material flows into the tool. Parting line would be just what it sounds like. There's 2 halves of the tool, and that parting line is basically where they come together. And so that the parting line is actually Kenner actually sort of planned that in the design stage and then in the sculpting stage, so that the parting line is kind of set up by the sculptor and worked into the actual 3-dimensional piece from the start. Mm-hmm. And they might make changes as it goes along, but that is very intentionally planned right from the conceptual to the sculpting stage, and then it's carried over into the actual production tool. And I think the reason for that is because, if you sculpt something and it's not going to set up correctly and you're not going to be able to make a tool out of it, you just wasted a bunch of time. So that has to be planned from the start, like where those 2 mold halves will eventually meet. And, I think that's why it says on that invoice that Josh posted that it would be agreed on beforehand, is that Kenner's engineers want to take a look at it and make sure, like, yes, this is what we want. before the folks at Gries go through the expense and the setting up of the actual thing. So that somebody has to probably go up there and look at it and be like, yes, check, this is right, before they go through with making it. So I think that's why that invoice mentions that.
Wow, that's a real surprise. That's outstanding teamwork and quality control. That's a real surprise.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're investing all that time and money into making an industrial product, you know, you don't want to design something that by the time you get it up to a company like Gries, they turn around and they're like, you know, this isn't moldable, or we're not able to do this, or it's going to cost 3 times as much. You know, they want to know from the start, like, yes, this is a shape that's going to work, you know, so there is a lot of planning there.
Absolutely. So that clearly explains what the gate mark on it then. Number 47 in the bottom corner. Any ideas, any theories to what number 47 would relate to?
I don't know. I think that's probably one of those details that's not really worth that much intrigue. You know, I think that's probably, and Mark Salati mentioned that the guy who had found the items, whose name is Frank Shuttle, had written that, and I think he may have written the smaller red thing that says Reb Soldier number 4, but the actual 47, Frank Shuttle didn't find 47 hard copy, so I don't think that's his. My guess is that somebody at Gries probably wrote that on there. They probably had maybe they got 60 hard copies, you know, 4-ups, and somebody numbered them to keep track of them. That would be my guess on the 47. Like, I don't think it has any meaning beyond, like, oh, they got a bunch and they put, like, just sequential numbers on there to keep track of what was what.
Yeah, it's often the case of collectors looking too much into things now.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's good because it's good to be detail-oriented, but sometimes it's like, well, it's just a number. There's probably 64 4-ups, and they just got numbered, and that's the number 47 out of that lot, right? Yeah. So, and they probably did that because if you're up there and you're some guy, as you know, because you were an engineer, right, and you worked in the die casting industry, like they just get a bunch of figures. He's not thinking, oh, this is Luke. You know, they're looking at it and saying, oh, hand me number 23, and there's probably a chart somewhere that referenced back the numbers to what Kenner was referring to them as, so they could keep them straight. That would be my guess on that number.
Yeah. So as I've been doing research on Gries, and I've come across Gries Dynacast in numerous times, so I'm now getting confused now. Is Dynacast part of the company name, or is Dynacast the name of the material that is used?
Well, if you look at that website, you know, well, first of all, I guess I should kind of go through what I did. Like, who was it? It was Tauntaun Scout is the name of the Facebook user who posted the figure on the Micro Collection Facebook group. When he posted that and Gries was written on the bottom, I'm like, well, you know, that's the name of the company that made the figures, right? So I just Googled Gries Foundry or something like that to bring up what I wanted, and I immediately got that website that I posted the link to, which was, I think Dynacast is basically the main name in there, right? Dynacast.com, right?
Yep.
And so, to be honest, I wasn't even remembering at the time that Gries had any sort of relationship with Dynacast, but clearly they do. If you look at the history of the company on the website, it was called Gries after the guy who moved, I think, from Germany to the United States and kind of pioneered some of these molding techniques. And at some point, Dynacast became part of the name. I was looking for something in there that explained that, but I did not find that. So I want to say that Dynacast and Gries, just based on the website, are synonymous, and they became kind of melded at some point. Obviously, collectors of Star Wars material know Dynacast because it's the name that we use to refer to the green urethane material that many hard copies are found in, right? So even that 4-up that was posted on the micro group, that is made of a material we know as Dynacast. And that's because we use that term because the Kenner folks that stuff came from always called that material Dynacast. And I actually have some receipts that were used by one of the vendors that made hard copies for Kenner for the Dynacast material. And it just, you know, it calls it 2 pounds Dynacast, right? And it's purchased from a distributor. So the material was known as Dynacast, and I would assume that since the company Gries was known as Dynacast, that the material Dynacast was also made by Gries or some affiliated company. I don't know that for sure, but I think that's a reasonable assumption. And if you think about it, that makes sense. You know, Gries is here making tooling, and a lot of these companies that are making 3-dimensional items and need to send them models would need a casting material that was formulated to the correct specification. So if you're in that business, it makes sense to make the casting material yourself and then sell it through a distributor or whatever. And then you have a little side business where you're selling the casting material that your clients are using to make the models that they eventually send to you. So I think that makes sense. I don't know that for sure, but I mean, I'd be shocked if that wasn't the case, that Dynacast had some relationship to Gries just based on the name, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So on that timeline, 65, Gries was bought out by Coates and Clark, and then Dynacast Canada bought Coates and Clark out in 67.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So that's probably ultimately where that name came from. Yeah. In my experience, though, when Kenner folks talked about the Montreal outfit that was making the figures, they always talked about Gries. So sometimes they would just say, "Oh, there's an outfit in Montreal that made all the figures." Yeah. So I never really associated the Dynacast name with that, but maybe it's just something I was aware of and then forgot. But I remembered it, or I realized it when I did that Google search, and then I just threw that link into that thread there, hoping that people would look at it, because I figured, I'm not trying to be opaque, right? But it's just like, to me, when you look at that link, it's like, oh, well, this is a company that does molding. Obviously, this is the company. It says Gries on the bottom because that's where this figure was sent, right? It was sent up there to make that tooling, which, hopefully people read through it and got a sense of that.
Absolutely. Now, referencing that then, the original poster was criticised for purchasing an expensive item without fully understanding what the piece is. Now, although, we don't know the seller, so the seller could have been yourself, for example, in which case it's unlikely that the original poster would have any doubts about it. So I don't want to comment too much on that. But in general, do you see a higher proportion of collectors purchasing products for, high amounts of money without fully understanding the piece, way more than what you did see in the Rebel Scum days?
I don't know. I don't know way more. I think that's always been the case. I don't, with collectibles in general, I think that there's, and I'm not really saying this to criticize anybody, I think there's just different ways to collect and different mindsets. But there's always been the group of collectors who really go hardcore into detail and sort of learning about things and kind of building mental models of, not just for prototypes, but just anything, Todd Chamberlain's a good example. He was collecting those Lily Lady dolls, the Star Wars dolls, going back into the 90s, and that guy built an entire narrative with charts and stuff on where each doll came from, who were the original sources. I mean, that's awesome. I would say 5% of collectors actually do something like that, right? And most people are not. They're just they're buying it. Oh, it's a Lily Lady Jawa, and they buy it and put it on a shelf, and they know a little bit about it, but they don't really spend that much time stressing over the little details, right? So I would say most collectors don't necessarily go to the nth degree to learn about what they're collecting, and that's fine. It's just a different way to go about things. The tricky part is when you get into prototypes, where so much of what you're buying is like contingent on knowing what it was used for, and I would say that's always been a problem in the Star Wars prototype hobby. People tend to understand first shots. I guess it's easy, like, oh, this is an early piece that came out of the mold, especially if it's a weird color, because then it gets an extra level of interest, right? Mm-hmm. For whatever reason, that's always been well understood, but the hard copies and even sculptings, and a lot of people, even prototype collectors, there's been a large contingent that's never really bothered to sit there and think through how they all fit into the process, right? So I would say that's not particularly new. It may be nowadays. I think back in the Rebel Scum days, say 1990, no, I guess maybe 2000 to 2006 or so, the Star Wars Collectors Archive was basically the only source for information and photos on a lot of that stuff. So in order to be collecting it, you almost had to be reading those old archive entries, which meant that you had a familiarity. Nowadays, I don't know if that's the case. I think stuff gets thrown around on Facebook and people don't even go back and read that stuff. And so maybe they're not as aware of what something was used for or how it fit into the process. That's my sense anyway, but I don't think it's new. Like I see collectors who are into prototypes and they aren't necessarily looking for hard copy pieces, or they aren't even asking about them, or when they come up, they almost seem to think that they're like green first shots, like they're first shots and they're just green or something, but they don't realize that it's a whole different step. It's actually closer to the sculpt in a lot of ways than it is to the production figure. And that's just how to get over that hump as far as learning goes. Like, I don't know, but it just seems that that's always been a place where a lot of collectors get lost a little bit for some reason.
Now, you've led nicely into my next point. So, do you think we're falling into the disposable media 30-second article kind of rat hole as collectors? Or do you think there's still a substantial chunk of collectors that were happily willing to read and engage with articles and discussions, many of which have been online for close to 2 decades now?
Yeah, I think as a culture in general, it's certainly, we don't read much anymore. And I include myself. Well, I read a lot of books and things, but like, I just find myself, I'm like a scroll culture, right? I guess that's a good way to, you're just so used to scrolling, and there's just, it's a constant dopamine hit where you get new content as you scroll to the bottom of the page. Like, and I find myself on Facebook or Twitter, and someone posts a link to an article or even a video that have to spend like a few minutes watching, and I'm interested in it, but I click on it and there's like a frustration. It's like, oh, I don't want to stop my scrolling to read through an article. That's certainly new, and that wasn't a mindset I had 15 years ago, right? Back then, it was like if I clicked on an article, I was at least spending a few minutes to scan through it or read it. Nowadays, the actual articles I read online are pretty few and far between. So I think just taking my own experience and expanding it to others, like, my guess is there's a lot of people out there who just don't really read that much of online content anymore. And that probably is also true of all the old archive entries that kind of explain hard copies and stuff. I think where they engage with it, they see someone post it on a Facebook group, and if there's not like a brief description in the contents of what it is, or in the comments of what it is, like, that's kind of, they're not really learning anything about it. So yeah, I would say there's been a change as far as how people engage with that kind of information over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, that's a real shame. I hate to see the SWC come top 10 hard copy battles or something. That seems to be what most websites are now.
Yeah, I mean, SWCA's got a lot of problems as far as like just being old and antiquated in some ways, but it's certainly, I just think that the larger problem is that people don't engage with it. Whereas, like I said, back in the day in Rebel Scum, it was easier. You almost had to click on the link to find out what it was, and then you ended up reading it, and people weren't, in that scroll mentality where they had so much information at their fingertips where they weren't pausing to look at stuff. So it was a different era. I do think in prototype collecting, we sort of need the new people to come in and know what this stuff is, because the reality of it is you're not pursuing a hard copy or a 4-up. Most people aren't anyway, without having some sense of what it is and how it fit into the process. And in order for new people to come in and be collecting this stuff, I think that information needs to be out there. It's just, what's the best way to get it out there and in front of people? And I'm not really sure what the answer is to that.
Well, the best way at the moment is to Sky and Steve on the Archivecast, because rolling it back to them, they're doing a tremendous job.
Yeah, well, you guys are doing a great job yourself.
Yeah, thank you.
A lot of the great content for Star Wars these days is on the podcast. From the Vintage Rebellion and from the Archivecast and other ones that are out there. I mean, I think that's, people really do engage with podcasts, and it's because they can take them on the go and put them on in their car. While they're cleaning their house, they can have it in the background, or while they're going for their run or whatever it is. That's a great forum, and I think that you and other people have done a great job in keeping some of the flame alive as far as the educating people goes. Whether the message about prototypes has gotten out there, I don't know. But again, I don't think that's new. I think there's always been a subset of collectors who really understood that stuff, and then a lot of other people who sort of just didn't think it through that hard for whatever reason.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, for sharing your thoughts. You've cleared a lot of points up for me, and I've learned a lot myself just by listening to you.
Yeah.
So thanks very much again for your time.
And just a couple of brief things too, Richard. Mark Salati mentioned in the comments of that thread that in Action Figure News issue number 66 from 1998, that find is shown, right? So the find that Rebel Soldier 4-Up came out of was featured in that magazine. So if you have or access to Action Figure News number 66, there is a find there with probably about, 15 4-Ups that were discovered. And I believe they were found in Canada. It was a guy named Frank Shuttle was the guy who had found them. And I believe they came out of Gries. They don't all say that on the base, but they're all similar. And I remember talking to Frank back when this happened. This is over 20 years ago now. But that's an interesting sort of historical date. And I can scan that page for you if you'd like. I can send it over
Absolutely,
to you.
yeah.
Thanks for Mark for mentioning that. I had actually bought from this find the Rebel Commander with the broken gun, the broken pistol. And I think I sold it to Tommy Garvey a few years later. But so that's an interesting piece. And also just remember all those buckets of unpainted micros that are out there, right? So that people still are buying and trading. Most of those probably came from Gries or a similar company where they just made a bunch and then they got dumped on the secondary market. Usually they would be sending those overseas, I think, to Asia, or they used to call it the Orient, which is probably not politically correct anymore. And that's where they'd be painted and packaged with the play sets and whatnot. So just helpful stuff to remember as you collect micro collection figures.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gus and Duncan's book on the micro collection is the go-to guide, I think, for these kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing book.
Some great content on there for sure.
Right, thanks very much, Ron. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to listening to you on the next episode of the Kivecast.
All right, Richard. Good luck going back to school, man. Hope to talk to you soon.
Hello there. You may remember me from The Empire Strikes Back. Now, don't forget to hit subscribe and also click the bell for notifications.